I'm very, very pleased to have Mr. James Mattoon here as our first speaker of the year. He is a 27-year veteran of the Air Force and a native of Fort Wayne, Indiana. He has a bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in international relations. He's been in the Park Service up at Vincennes at the George Rogers Clark Museum for 1.5 to 2 years. Prior to that, he had worked, interestingly enough, with his Air Force background, at the Wright Brothers Museum at the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and also at the Dayton, Ohio Aviation Museum, and also at the John Adams Museum, President John Adams, in Quincy, Massachusetts. He says that while he's traveled extensively in the States and abroad, living overseas in England, Korea, and Abu Dhabi, he's always happiest when he looks out the airplane window and sees the very flat farmlands of Indiana, or he looks out his car window and sees basketball hoops, because he knows he's back home in Indiana. So let's give a warm welcome to Mr. James Mattoon.
Thank you. I'd ask you where you're all from, but you're probably all from Indiana. That makes it easy. When we're usually getting visitors at the park and stuff, we usually get a lot of people from different states. And that's usually the first question I ask them when I take them up to the monument: where are you from? Because I like to be able to tell them stories about the monument and about the history of the park, but I want to be able to associate it with where they're from, if they're from Michigan or Kentucky or wherever they're from. So that's a really important question. We might think that all these states are different. They do have some different things about them, different sizes, different populations. We do corn, basketball, whereas another state may do cotton, and it may do football better than we do. Every state's different. But they do have one very important thing, or two important things. One, they all share the same rights, and they all share the same representation. This is kind of something different for the rest of the world, because when they gather new states or new territories, they tend to not treat them the same, at least in the 1700s. It was very different for the 13 states to start accepting other states with the same equal status as they had. What created this? And why is it so much different? A little historical context might be needed. To start with, we'll talk about the battle at Vincennes and what it's going to lead to. The monument does a really good story about that when you look at the different murals or paintings inside. And it does tell you the ending of the story, not just the end of the battle, but what it accomplished. The battle at Vincennes was between the British and the Americans, but it also included French and Native American. The Americans and the French, George Rogers Clark's people, they had about 180 French and American volunteers. The volunteers from France came from Kaskaskia, Cahokia area, whereas the Americans were from Virginia and from Kentucky, Tennessee, that area. Inside the fort, there was actually 35 British regulars, give or take, but they also had about 45 Detroit volunteers, so we'll call them Detroit Canadians or Detroit French Canadians. But they also had some Vincennes militia. The battle was only about 2.5 days. We don't know of any British that were killed, but we do know several were wounded. We do know that their native allies were killed during the battle outside the fort, and we only know of one American that was wounded, and we're pretty sure none were killed, because that's what they wrote about. Like I said, it's a very short battle, but it's a very important battle. It may not compare to the size of Yorktown or Saratoga, but for its impact, it was just as important as those battles in creating our nation. And one of the main reasons is because George Rogers Clark and his men, when the war is over, they can claim all of that Northwest Territory, or what we like to refer today as the Old Northwest Territory. How is that so? Well, George Rogers Clark in his battles and stuff had controlled a lot of forts. The fort at Vincennes, he's going to maintain control of it. But there's also the posts at Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and some of those areas on the Mississippi River. And more importantly, there's also Fort Jefferson at the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi River, and the fortress he has down at the Falls of the Ohio, really close to here. He's going to maintain these forts until the end of the war. Why would the forts make a difference? Well, they're all on waterways. And the waterways back then were the highways. If you control those waterways, you control everything. And George Rogers Clark's men are going to control that till the end of the war. During the negotiations at Paris in 1783 between Britain and America, one of the great contentions was where the boundary would be between the two countries. Britain wanted the boundary at the Ohio River. They were willing to concede Kentucky and Tennessee, which are basically south of the Ohio River, but they wanted that boundary at the Ohio River. And the reason being is they wanted to create a buffer state between America and their fur trading power up in Canada, and they wanted it inhabited with the North American allies. Those natives, they wanted them to inhabit that area to prevent future American aggression. However, John Adams, my boy, and Benjamin Franklin were really quick to point out we controlled that territory through those forts of Clark, and thusly, America is going to secure the Northwest Territory, and the boundary will be drawn where? At the Great Lakes, and that's where it is today. So now we have this land, but who really owns it? Well, one really important contention, important fact, was George Rogers Clark was not commissioned by the Continental Congress. He was commissioned by Virginia. So Virginia could claim the whole old Northwest Territory and also Kentucky and a portion of Tennessee. How do you think the smaller states thought about that? Well, they were afraid that Virginia would become the dominant state and would have too much power. So, therefore, for Virginia to join that new union of states, they're going to have to concede Kentucky and the Old Northwest. Because not only did they want to join the new union of states, but they also, very importantly, wanted their war debts assumed by the U.S. government. That was quite the burden for all the states. So getting to join the union meant that Alexander Hamilton, will help create those finances. That was one of the big things that really made America soluble, was getting rid of those debts. So Virginia didn't have a choice. She had to give up those extra territories. So now America has it. And unfortunately, this is pre-Constitution. So our Articles of Confederation Congress, what are they going to do with this new territory? And it was an idea they'd better figure out really quickly how they were going to manage it and how they were going to profit from it. Because if not, all the squatters on the land, and that is technically all the people that are out there, like Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, they're out there settling it. They consider them squatters because they haven't actually paid for the land from the government, and they haven't acknowledged that they own it. But more importantly, they were worried about speculators selling off that land and driving down prices, but more importantly, instigating fights with Native Americans for that same land. So what is America going to do? Well, the Congress, with the help of some very far-sighted individuals like Messiah Cutler and Rufus Putnam, are going to pass something called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Unlike the other ones they'd already passed, this one's pretty comprehensive. Not only is it going to explain how to manage the states or territories, but also how to create states from it. And that's really important, because not only is it going to tell us how to do it then, but it's also going to help those new territories that are formed later and the new states kind of set a guideline for them. And that's really important. So the ordinance was a document that was pretty important, and we need to discuss that ordinance because that's really what sets us up later on in the future. The standard practice of the time for Europe was when they would actually conquer territory, they would add it to their country, but they would make it a vassal state or a colony with much less rights than the controlling nation. Here, though, the Northwest Territory is not created as a colony for the original 13 states, but it's actually consolidated as a territory, and a governor is appointed. Originally, it's going to be Arthur St. Clair, but he's appointed by Congress to be in charge of that territory. And each territory is going to break off, become a state, and we'll have Indiana Territory. Who was our governor? William Henry Harrison. He's also appointed by the state. But it didn't stop there. They actually had a plan to create states out of this territory. So they set up a guideline on how that's going to happen. And it's going to carry on to future territories and future states. The first thing that happens with that governor is as the population starts to increase, he reports it to Congress, says the population's increased to 5,000. And so at that point, they have to start creating legislation or legislators, voting people, giving greater rights to the local and then eventually the national level. And so once the population reaches a very important number, 60,000, it sounds like a lot, but back then it is a lot. That's why they waited to that point. Once it reaches 60,000, then the state could vote, the voters could vote to become a state. That's important. And then they create their own state constitution. And the last most important step, Congress has to approve them as a state. And there's going to be a little controversy about that later on, especially with states like Ohio and Michigan when they're arguing about borders, Toledo, for example. But some of them are pretty easy, like Indiana. There's not a lot of controversy there. Once Indiana creates a state constitution, Congress pretty much accepts us pretty quickly. So that is important. But it didn't stop there. But by allowing the people to create greater and greater rights as they have a greater population, the country was really, or the ordinance was really trying to set up things to prove that America was a democracy of the people. But it also provided some very important rights. And this is where Northwest Ordinance is going to kind of fall apart a little later on in time as each state gets formed, because a lot of these territorial governors, like William Henry Harrison, where is he from? He's from Virginia. And they have their own concepts and beliefs, slavery, for example. We're going to find it kind of conflicts with what this Northwest Ordinance also discussed. And it was definitely a document ahead of its time, because it provided some very important rights that were written down. And this is pre-Constitution. One of those rights was freedom of religion, the right of trial by jury, and your property could not be taken by consent. But more importantly, it also would not allow slavery or indentured servitude in the territory unless for a punishment of a crime. This is definitely ahead of its time. This is passed early 1787. The Constitution doesn't even come into effect, or at least get started until late 1787. But it also was earlier than the Bill of Rights, that freedom of religion, freedom of trial by jury. That's 1791. And that slavery, the restrictions on slavery, 1865, the 13th Amendment. But like I said, there's a little controversy in that, though. They actually would vote for if they were going to allow slavery in those states quite a few times. And one of the sad parts is the way they set it up, that governor appointed by Congress had absolute veto power. So if the legislation said we don't want slavery, he could veto it if he decided to want it. But luckily, he at least listened to the people on that one. There is some other problems with William Henry Harrison, obviously, and we like to say at Vincennes we were the first territorial capital, but did we become the state capital? No, why? It moves to Cordon. And one of the main reasons is William Henry Harrison owned a lot of the land in Vincennes. And I guess they thought it was a little unethical to have to buy the land from the governor to build state capitals and stuff like that. So as soon as he went off to war, the capital moved down to Cordon, and that's where it becomes the first state capital. So that is some of the problems with the Northwest Ordinance, but at least we never did get slavery, and it really does set things up later on for the Civil War, because all those northern states are going to become pro or free states, whereas the South doesn't have that. One of the main reasons, who's settling the Northwest Territory? Anybody have a guess where they're from? Center states?
Germany and
What about from America?
Kentucky, Tennessee, and that area.
A lot of them, believe it or not, coming into Indiana, Ohio especially. Rufus Putnam is a perfect example. One of the ones that got the Northwest Ordinance passed. Where's he from?
Pennsylvania.
He's from Pennsylvania. And where's Messiah Cutler from? He's from Massachusetts, and his son is going to be a judge in Ohio. one of the legislators that actually really fights to make sure slavery is not included in the state constitution. Because his dad went all that trouble to get the passage of the Northwest Ordinance and get that slavery clause in there to prevent it. So his son is going to fight just as hard when they write the state constitutions. And it works out that way really, really well. Every state has some problems with it. Indiana's not too bad. Illinois, though, that is one of the big contentions during the convention. And I read a book. I actually wrote it down. Let's see if I can find the name of it real quick. It's called Statehood and Nation by Peter Onuff. And one of the main points about it is what the Northwest Ordinance accomplished. But more importantly, about how that states, when they started becoming states, like Illinois, how they started discussing should we have slavery or not. It's a nice thing about the Northwest Ordinance, it actually starts to migrate not only as a document or as a law, but it also eventually starts to become a theory or a thought. Kind of sets the way for future documents. And that's really important too in our story. So we have the Northwest Ordinance, and it's all about the Northwest Territory. What does the Northwest Territory include? Well, today it includes the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, a portion of Minnesota anyway. And each new territory that came after that Northwest Territory is also going to share some of the same equality, equal rights, some of the same rules that were set up by the Northwest Ordinance. It also has some of the same rules that it's going to apply later on. It's kind of the belief that the Northwest Ordinance, while not a constitutional law, was the way they wanted to do things. And it kind of translates to the newer territories. Like, for example, the Arizona Territory. When it becomes a territory, it's going to have a governor appointed by Congress, and it has the same rules apply for it to become a state. In fact, the only state that kind of violates that rule, and it's because it's during the Civil War, was Nevada. Nevada didn't even have close to 60,000, but they wanted the silver mines, and they actually were afraid they were going to lose the Civil War. So they wanted to make sure that they had it as a state before the war ended. So it's the only one to violate that rules. But most of the other states had at least 60,000 before they could vote to become a state, create their own state constitution, and then Congress approved them as a state. And that other part is really important as well, because what happens to Texas? It takes a long time to become a state because there's a lot of political considerations involved. But it's the same thing. Congress has to approve them. I do laugh, though. I read an article the other day. One of those Northwest Territory states, it actually skipped that last step and was not accepted by Congress. Anyone know which state that is? It didn't happen until the 1960s. Ohio. Ohio never actually got voted in Congress to become a state. They just figured, hey, we accepted the Constitution, so you must be a state, but they never actually held a vote. I was reading an article about that. Look it up. It's kind of interesting. Ohio, they were joking about it, that Ohio did not become a state until about the 60s. And so they had to go back and do a new ceremony to say they are now a state. So go figure. So after the territories, we have the territories and the rules to become states. So is there no territories left in America? Can anyone name a territory?
Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico. We actually have about 12 territories. There's a lot of small ones like Wake Island and things like that, Midway, for example. But the most important ones that we remember are Guam, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and America Samoa. And each of those has non-representatives in Congress, so they have their own congressmen, but they don't get to vote. That's the important thing, is they're non-voting representatives. But that's set by the Northwest Ordinance. That was one of the ideas in there as a principle. More importantly, if they wanted to become a state, they could become a state. And Puerto Rico is one of those that has voted to become a state at least once and passed by 51%. Guess what step got skipped and hasn't been done yet? The Congress has never accepted them. So until Congress accepts them, they can't become a state. I guess they think that 51% is not enough voters, I guess. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. But that is very important. These territories could become states, and they all share the same equal rights when they do become states. Like, for example, when Hawaii and Alaska become states, how many senators did Hawaii and Alaska get? Two. How many senators in California? Two. How many in Indiana? Two. Now, grant you, we don't have the same number of representatives, but it's so balanced that it's based on population. So the more population you have, the more representatives you have. And it's a lot more equal today than it was in the 1850s, 1840s, because what was the problem back then? They were counting the slaves. What was that, the 3/5 law? So little issues there before that, but nowadays your representatives based on the number of people you have in your state and your senators, and you all share the same equal rights as well. And hopefully the same taxes too, but hey, just as long as we don't count gas prices. So anyway, in conclusion, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions and stuff because I have only just touched on the Northwest Territory. But in conclusion, one of the important things I think really explains Northwest Ordinance is that a Virginia statesman, Edward Carrington, he was a statesman and a soldier, writing to Thomas Jefferson, stated that the two leading objects of the Northwest Ordinance was to create a temporary state in the West, or temporary government in the West, and then allow for its more easy passage into permanent state governments. So they were really thinking of that ahead. George Rogers Clark and his frontiersmen kind of gave the nation a new chance to do something nearly unprecedented in history. Not only would the 13 original states welcome in new territories, but they also allowed new states in. They didn't make them colonies to themselves. Nope, they accepted equal states, giving up some of their power, believe it or not, sharing it with other states. That's never been done before, at least not very often. You can't see England doing that, no. Back then they accepted Ireland not with their own rights or even their own parliament. They accept them inside the Union, but on their own terms. Whereas America did that definitely very differently. And hopefully, the Northwest Ordinance will provide in the future, kind of encourage future states to join, using that as a precedence. And our country will continue to expand. And it can expand. We could have Puerto Rico as a state. We could have Guam as a state. We could even have Washington, D.C. as a state, but you know how that would work very well. But it is possible. And that's what the Northwest Ordinance really did provide, and why it really is important. Because while it is not a constitutional law, it did create a framework and an influence to future documents. And that's one of the things I really noticed in that book about nations and statehood. That they said even though later on they couldn't even agree on who actually wrote it for Congress, the concepts behind it still continue on to this day, because territories still get to have their own representatives. Non-voting representatives, but they still get to have non-voting representatives. They still have the same rights, basic, as all the other states do, if they do become states. And that is all set out by that Northwest Ordinance. Something George Rogers Clark kind of provided because he gave us a bunch of new land, and Congress had to figure out how to take care of it. And it was a little short, but hopefully you have time to answer any questions you want.
The Northwest Ordinance allowed for schools, like township schools, I believe, and that was a really new idea, like public schools in each township. And do you know anything? That is something I think that was.
It kind of provided the taxes for it, but it was actually community schools, not colleges.
Right.
Because I read that Pioneers book by David McCullough, and that was one of the main things they talk about was Cutler really wanted to make sure that there was a college for further education in the West. So even though they thought Harvard was great, that's where they went, but they want to have something in Ohio. That's why Ohio has a lot of big universities, and one of them started right there in Marietta because of those individuals. But it actually did provide for smaller schools, for more like elementary schools.
Right.
That time.
Yeah, that's what I understood.
Yep, that all came from the Northwest Ordinance.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the concepts that came about through rights for individuals, that of the timing of the Northwest Ordinance versus the Constitution?
They have passed these laws, and a lot of it is from Messiah Cutler. He's a preacher, from Massachusetts. They have their own views there. And he wanted to implement a lot of that into the Northwest Ordinance. And believe it or not, the Southerners also voted for, a restriction of slavery in those territories. Why would they do that? You'd think, wow, you want to let slavery everywhere. No, they actually didn't want the competition. It was all about finance for them. For the Northerners, it was mostly about moral obligations. But for the Southerners, a lot of them, it was about finance. But that's not always, I don't want to say that's all of them, because I love the best example ever is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson probably influenced it. That's why he was getting a letter from Edward Carrington talking about it and stuff. Because Thomas Jefferson wrote what in the Declaration of Independence that got struck out? He actually makes a very big mention about slavery and the evils of it. Can you imagine a guy that owns 200 slaves writing that in there? Because even he felt guilty about slavery and wanted the institution to end. Why didn't it end? Why didn't he get rid of the slaves? We go back to finance. When he dies, he has no money and you have to sell everybody off and all his stuff. So really, finances weren't really the best. They were always living on, cotton was definitely always on credit. And if cotton was bad sale that day, you were going to lose your t-shirt and everything else. But as for the rest of the rights, they already had those concepts. And you have Madison and Morone and stuff, they want to write that in there. They're going to be part of the Constitutional Convention, a lot of those congressmen that voted on the Northwest Ordinance. So they applied that there. Unfortunately, I say it's in there, but you know how the caveats are back then. Especially once the Constitution is written, some of those things are kind of vague. Freedom of religion, definitely trial by jury, but the indentured servitude and slavery, one, it never grandfathered what was already there, especially in Indiana. Who are the biggest slave owners in Indiana when Indiana becomes a territory? Anybody know?
William Henry Harrison.
He's got some. It's actually the French. They have to actually grandfather it in to allow you to have your slaves because of the French. And then they get even dirtier. A lot of the people coming in would have indentured servitude that was forced into indentured servitude. Because you came outside the state and you're grandfathered in for some reason, they could force you to be a slave, and we'll just call you an indentured servitude until 1820, I think it was.
The French had slaves.
Yes, the French did have slaves. And not only did they have black slaves, African Americans, they also had Native American slaves. Believe it or not. Now, grant you slavery, especially by the time Indiana's a state, all that's died out. But there was still some slave trading even down, I hate to say it, down here on the water. And that is true. There's a story about Lincoln as a kid seeing slaves being sold right here in Indiana when he was at the port, somewhere down here. I forgot exactly where the port was.
Wasn't it Troy? Or over there by where across in Troy, Indiana?
Yeah, I think so.
And Cannleton, I think, is also
Yeah.
another place. Yeah.
And it's definitely on the Indiana side.
Yeah.
So wait a second, didn't the Northwest Ordinance say that was illegal? So they're always skirting that. And later on, it's going to become worse because the Northwest Ordinance isn't considered a constitutional law. So when you get later territories, it's kind of a vague, Congress makes decisions. And the biggest part of that book I was reading was Ohio and Michigan and the Toledo corridor. Because Northwest Ordinance also provides rules on what becomes a state, how that territory is going to be split up, how the Northwest Territory got split up. And they're going to kind of skirt their way around it. It's amazing how they both used, Michigan and Ohio both used the Northwest Ordinance in their arguments. Can you believe that? This says this, but this says this. So it shows that it's written by human beings that don't necessarily get things in black and white. It's a long way to answer your question, but that's kind of how it works. That's why I said later on it becomes a spiritual document more than anything else. It's reference for future documents. In fact, when we get right up to the Civil War, they go back to talking about the Northwest Ordinance, and pro-abolitionists are actually saying that Thomas Jefferson wrote it because he knew that slavery was evil, and that's literally the wording they used. in their discussion, especially in Illinois. So, anyone have another question? Yes.
You know, when we were doing research here at the museum on some of our founding fathers, so to speak, where we found out with a few of them that they owned slaves, and they kept them in Kentucky. You know, they also owned land over there, but
They
now
kept their
they brought them
farms
over
over
here,
there.
and we know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of our, no one can deny that here.
Yeah.
And I assume it's because, well, we were awful close, you know, how it was certainly easy enough to transport back and forth across the river
Yeah.
at the time.
But now, even before we became a state, there was something written about Vincennes where they had slaves, but it was dying out. They weren't allowed to bring in more, so it was starting to die
Well,
out.
this would have been the end of the 1700s.
Yeah, yeah, and so I would say even in the 1800s, about the time William Henry Harrison shows up, it's already starting to die out. And he never, you would think he'd be, I'm the big slave owner from Berkeley Plantation, I'm going to make sure it's allowed in in the territory. He doesn't. He might have his own, but he doesn't, and he doesn't tell the French you can't have theirs, but he lets it die out. So, for whatever reason, he doesn't really write it down as why he did it.
Well, and then most of the people were coming through Pennsylvania, and they were certainly not slave owners.
No. And especially the Massachusetts people settling in Ohio and stuff.
That's what we found with our research, is the ones who did have slaves had come up from Tennessee, and then the ones who didn't had come across from Pennsylvania. So, kind of
We had a really
interesting.
big discussion the other day about one very important person. And I think it's kind of ironic that he never made any money off of his invention, but his invention really set up the Civil War. And I read a really beautiful article about it, and I really agree with it. His name's Eli Whitney. The cotton gin. Without cotton, there's a beautiful book called What If? And that was one of the things, is what if the cotton gin was not invented? There would have been no slavery. It had died out. It had died out because there's, up here in the north, why don't we have any slaves?
We don't think of it.
They don't pick cotton.
Right.
Picking corn, anybody can do it, and it's easy. And once you start creating machinery to do it, it's even easier. Cotton was very, very, very labor intensive, but it was also very, very profitable. Even indigo, rice, and some of those other things, the only thing that made it labor intensive was the fact that your help was going to die faster than you could hire new ones. So you would just use slave labor because they're only treated as property, and that's the truth. And so if they die, I don't have to be at the plantation during yellow fever season. I can let my slaves do it and my, worker do it, and that's the truth. So up here in the north, didn't have a lot of death from weather or anything like that. It wasn't like yellow fever or malaria all over the place. And picking corn or picking soybeans or doing that wasn't as labor intensive, so it just would have died out up here. Whereas down south, they need it for that cotton gin to keep feeding that machine. So,
I had a
Yes.
question about these 5 states that came out of the Northwest Territory. I've often wondered how Michigan got the UP, the Upper Peninsula.
they
Is there
actually,
any story about that? Because
yes,
it goes
and it's in that book as well.
Yeah.
They already had a portion of it. That's a misconception. They got the UP. We gave up Toledo and got the whole UP. No, they already had a good portion of it. But the portion they didn't have was closer to Wisconsin. And what's important in there? It's the silver mines. So in the end, they made a heck of a lot more money. But at the time, they were like, oh, great, we just got more land no one wants, or more trees. Now we have to get rid of the trees. Then we actually, gave up that beautiful port of Toledo. And Toledo is a really important port. I am from Fort Wayne. We mentioned that earlier. I have to point out, why was Fort Wayne so important? And Toledo kind of leads into that.
Wabash River.
Yes. The only portage, the only land I have to cross is in Fort Wayne, and it's only 9 miles, and I can go from Lake Erie all the way down to New Orleans. That's why that Wabash Erie Canal is so important. So Fort Wayne, once you put a fort right there, that was Wayne saying, ha ha, I control everything. That's why there were over 1,000 natives in Fort Wayne before that fort was there, because they were making money off people using that portage. That's why we go back to Clark owning all those forts and stuff. They were controlling the waterways. So when Wayne put that fort there, he now says, I control all the waterways in the entire passage, and I don't have to tax anybody now. So that's definitely very important. That's why the Toledo corridor back then was so important, because of the waterways. It was the transportation network. You could start taxing people if you wanted to, coming through that port, heading down the river of the Maumee. So I could tax boats and stuff like that, so make a lot of money. So Toledo would have been very, very profitable going in and going out. But in the end, the silver mines were much better.
They never really developed the Wabash River into a great waterway. They built the Erie Canal at great expense. Why didn't they put in dams and dredge it there?
Do you know one of the things I learned about Indiana? As long as, and I haven't lived here, I grew up here, but I spent a lot of time elsewhere. So I get to see the rest of the world, and stuff like that. But come to find out, and actually you could read Hamilton's journal, it's online for Governor Hamilton's journal, from the time he finds out, hey, by the way, the fort's been captured at Sackville, all the way to the point where he goes to jail. And all of a sudden, this journal stops immediately when he goes to jail because they took all his pencils and paper away. Definitely didn't like the man. But his journal is very, very clear about the trip down the Wabash and down the Maumee River. They're terrible rivers. They got a lot of rapids, a lot of low points. In fact, why did Abraham Lincoln enter Illinois right across from Vincennes? In fact, in 1830, March 6th, he takes the ferry across. Why there? It was actually the shallowest area on the river, and that's where the ferry was. So I actually saw the water as low as 2.5 feet this summer. Me, not somebody else, me. Right now it's 20 feet because it's flooded, but its average is only 5 or 8 feet right there under the bridge. In fact, a lot of times under one of the pylons you can see land. So not a very good navigatable river. The other thing I learned from Indiana, especially working this park, do you know Indiana is one of the few states where it's illegal, it's against Indiana law, to go in debt for the government. Why is that? He answered it right there. The canals. The canals bankrupt the state so bad it wasn't even funny. Because the canal was so impractical. If you look at it, like go up Delphi, that's where part of the canal is. Most of the canal never actually followed the river. You would think I'm going to just do a couple over the rapids, a couple for low points, up points, locks and stuff like that. No, we literally built an entire river all the way through because none of it was actually navigable. And that's a true story. There were some boats on the Wabash here, but a lot of them had to use canals a lot of the way. And so that canal cost a fortune. And for as long as they used it and how much money they made off it, it was bankrupting. That's why Indiana has 2 seasons, winter and construction. Because we have to stop road work every time they run out of money. And that's true. Any other questions? No more questions? No more comments? No more good jokes? Yes.
So really, the Wabash was never a really navigable river, and
It's got a lot of shallow spots.
right.
You couldn't. It was not like the Mississippi where I could have a paddle wheeler on it. In fact, I think Vincennes had one built, just one, and it would just journey people up and down the river for tours more than anything else, and take some cargo. But it was not what you would call a big boat river.
So why was Vincennes so important then?
Well, at the time, the French traders, it was great because I could canoe up and down
they were
those
fine with
rivers.
just little
Little
canoes.
canoes are nothing, but how much can a canoe carry?
Right.
I could carry some furs.
Right.
Vincennes is also one of the great stories that I heard, and I think it's pretty true. The native village was not actually at Vincennes. It is during our story, but they actually were elsewhere. The Pankasaw Indians were elsewhere, and the French cajoled them into moving there so they could make them as trading partners. But they weren't actually native to that area. I guess nobody was living there at the time. The other good story, what's Vincennes' motto, or what's its city's nickname? They call it the first city. Is it really the first city? Well, it's not even the first outpost, it was the third. Kikiunga was first. Where's Kikiunga? Fort Wayne. And the second outpost was Quinteron, or Winteron. Where's that? Lafayette.
Lafayette. Right.
Yep. Third one was down there, and there were trading posts. And they would hang out for the time to collect their furs and stuff. But in the winter, they would skedaddle back to Canada or go down south, where it's warmer and they can grow food. Well, the glaciers stop about Terre Haute, Indianapolis area, so everything below that was pretty good land. It's not gouged or treed or anything else. It's hard to believe there's so many trees in Indiana at one time, and buffalo. That's why they have state seal shows them both dying and leaving. So they're in Vincennes quite a bit for trading, but someone realized you could really farm here. And so they started planting crops and staying. So they become the first permanent European city. Not the first city, because I'm from Fort Wayne. I think 1,000 natives, that's a city. I mean, that is probably a city. You know, that's why Park Service likes to use caveats a lot. You know, Wright brothers, I could go for an hour on telling you the caveat on the first airplane that ever flew, because it's the first man-powered, controlled, heavier than air airplane. So you have to add all the caveats, or someone's going to argue and say, what about a blimp? Or what about, you know, Langley, who flew off a houseboat and crashed right into the water as soon as he launched? You know, you're flying until you hit the ground. So it's the same thing with First City. It's the first European permanent settlement in Indiana. And it was French. Definitely recommend going up there to visit it. Not only do you have my park, but you also have the oldest Catholic church in Indiana, 1826. And more importantly, you have the oldest building in Indiana, which is Grouseland. Or I should say the oldest completed building, more caveats. The oldest completed building, because the territorial capital was actually started first. But I guess William Henry Harrison wanted his house done, so they finished it in 1804. And because it's brick, it is more original, so it is the oldest building in Indiana. So, any other questions?
For the fur trade, beavers was a big, but they kind of got pretty well wiped out. Has the state departments brought them back yet on the Wabash, or is
Not
that just-
really. The Wabash is a really weird river, and we got a picture in a display case because we do like art in the park. We've been doing, you know, showing pictures and stuff. And one of the pictures I had framed was one of our seasonal, was a naturalist from Evansville. He was really good into nature. He did a little research. Come to find out, James Audubon was visiting not only George Rogers Clark, but he also ended up in Vincennes to paint a picture of a bird. We looked at the stats on this bird. That bird is 200 miles out of its range if it's in Vincennes. It followed the river corridor. And I've heard rumors there's bears floating around in Evansville every once in a while, because somehow they make it off the river. We used to, at one time, had a lot of animals. In fact, we got a lot of the furs, all the furs we have in our display with our mannequins and stuff. All of them were in Indiana at one time. So we had black bear, we had deer, we had badger, we had beaver, obviously, and bobcat. Some of those are still around, the deer, obviously. Some of them are long, long gone. And, you know, if they come back, it'll be following the river back into the area. But Indiana's changed quite a bit. That's why I was joking about the state seal. If you ever look at the state seal of Indiana, it's got a guy cutting down trees, and there's a buffalo jumping over a dead tree. We actually had plains buffaloes. In fact, the bridge right in front of the monument was the buffalo trace, and they could follow right across the river into Illinois. That's why they set up the ferry port there, and that's why the trading post was there, because everybody's following that same route into Illinois. In fact, I didn't realize it until I started researching it a little more. A lot of our roads, a good portion of them, especially in the east, are all following old animal trails or native trails. And that's why Indiana's the crossroads of America. It's because it was following so many different trails across the state.
What year did the buffalo become extinct in Indiana?
George Rogers Clark talks about them, you know, looking for them while they're hunting, making it their journey across Illinois and Indiana, especially when they're up to their neck in water. And he talks about all the buffalo not being there, so they were kind of surprised they were missing. So they had to be here at least until the late 1700s. But I think the seal shows them running away, and the seal's done very close after 1816. So I would have to say by 1816 they're probably all gone. So, and it's because of hunting and everything else. I've seen what they look like. I guess there's a European buffalo bison that's from Europe. I don't know what country, but they say they look very close to what the woodland buffaloes look like. A little bit smaller, bigger hunchback at the back. Not as big as the plains buffalo, but pretty darn big. You know, for bigger than a cow. And for all the trees we had, and we had a lot of trees, that was one of the big things that they write about. Rufus Putnam writes and talks about it in David Culler's book, They're Pioneers. They spent all the time cutting down trees. You'd be amazed how many trees they cut down. And I'm surprised by it because I worked at John Adams's house, and one of his biggest investments was buying a forest. Why would he buy acres of trees?
Firewood.
Do you know in New England in the 1700s, they were exporting wood from Canada? True story. True story. So John was actually saving a lot of money by having his own trees. Whereas in Indiana, especially in Ohio, they were cutting trees down and just throwing them away, burning them, because they didn't know what to do with them. They had too many. So go figure. Nowadays, they're none. In fact, do you know why we have trees nowadays? Go on a side story.
Well, for wood, for lumber,
Why do we see as many trees as we do in Indiana?
reforestation.
Reforestation. After the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, FDR, one of the laws he passed was the reforestation of the farmlands to act as a windbreak against the sand and the dust. And so we started planting trees everywhere, and they actually now have a policy in the government on how to manage farmland and stuff like that, and how to get trees planted.
It was
Yes.
February when George Rogers Clark and his married men left St. Genevieve and traipsed, I think it was St. Genevieve,
Kaskaskia, but yeah.
well,
Same area.
that same area,
Yep.
and traipsed across Illinois, the bottomland of Illinois, flat as a flitter, but lots of creeks and even a small Wabash River. They made it to the Indiana, or to the end of Illinois where the Wabash River was. February. They didn't have good clothes, I mean, no goose down clothing like we've got. When you think about it, how horrible. I mean, and their boots.
I get that question a lot, and I have an answer for it.
What's that?
Because we've discussed it quite a bit.
Bear grease?
Bear grease is a possibility. We can't prove it.
Yeah.
That's the problem. But here's something you have to understand about hypothermia, and I am military, traced through swamps and everything else. The number one rule they said is once you're on dry land, you better warm up and dry up as fast as possible, because if it's too cold, you're going to get hypothermia and die. People don't get hypothermia in the water very often. They get it on the dry land with the wind blowing on them. But what advantage do they have? You talk about clothes. Their clothes are better than ours. And why? Because they're all wearing skins. Those animals don't die from hypothermia, so why would we do it? Their clothes dry a lot faster because they're furs, and they insulate a lot better. Keep the cold air out, keep the warm air in, and they let you sweat better. Our clothes breathe really well because it's designed to. I would not want to go tracing through water in this outfit. Even in the military, I wouldn't want to do it. In fact, some of them would actually wear wetsuit underneath their clothes, especially SEALs, to keep from getting hypothermia. The other thing is, special ops guys can do it today, they can make a fire without smoke and with very little light. So until Clark got really, really close to Vincennes, every time they got dry land, they would set fires out and, huddle around the fire and hug each other really closely, because we're all going to sing Kumbaya because we're freezing to death. The other important factor, and this is something that doesn't get mentioned very often, the reason it was all flooded is because it was a very unseasonably warm winter. It had been freezing just a month before, but then it jumped into that weird, what was the weather like on Wednesday, by the way, down here? Was it 70 degrees like it was in Vincennes? 70 degrees, and then the next day I'm freezing and wearing my gloves again, and my hands are starting to dry out. So that was what it was. It was a very warm day until the last day. Clark's guys are starving. They keep running out of food. That's kind of the part of their story. When they marched to Kaskaskia, they ran out of food. When they marched on Vincennes, they ran out of food. Well, everything's flooded. There's no deer around for them to hunt, so they are starving. In fact, I heard one story, one of the islands they found in the middle of all that flooded area, they called it Possum Island because it was full of possums. And since the island is smaller than this room for 180 people, those possums didn't get away very fast. So needless to say, they either drowned or got ate by the locals. So, but by the time he gets to the last trip, he's going to make one more journey across the Wabash. They're starving to death. He's already had to force them to go once. He put gunpowder on his face and screamed, "Hoorah!" and jumped into the water, and they followed him. But that was the day before. The last day there was ice on the water, and they have to get across. He has Captain Bowman and about 20 people fall out with rifles and tells them to shoot anybody that falls behind. They talk about that in the video. The joke is they didn't have any gunpowder. It was all wet. They weren't going to fire anything, but the idea is there, and that's just to motivate him to go. Clark has already motivated him as much as he can, so the last thing is to show him that, you need to go. And then the idea was they're going to go anyway because they can't turn around. It's too late. It's Cortez burning his ships at Veracruz. Once those ships are burnt, he knows his guys have to keep going with him or they're going to die. And it's the same thing. And Clark is always planning ahead. He shows up. We do the last 5 miles back in February 25th, just the volunteers and us, because right now it's kind of hard to commute back and forth for everybody. Carpool for hundreds of people. So there was only about 10 of us or so. But we did the last 5 miles. Every 5 years they do the last 10 miles right from the river so forth. But it ends at the cemetery with a big hill. Why is that so important? Because Clark brought a bunch of flags with him and had his guys march behind that hill in formation with those flags, and they just keep swapping out flags. So everyone could just see the smoke or the dust from their marching and these flags flying through the breeze. Remember, these guys are starving, frozen to death, and they're still at 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night, marching with flags so that the fort would think they have 1,000 troops. And the battle is a night battle. Clark does surround the fort. And one of the stories go, Hamilton could hear the gunfire and thought it was the natives just being restless, or the local Vincennes people mad that he took away the billiards table, because that's what he does the first day he shows up. And so he just ignores it until the sergeant next to him goes, "Ah!" and falls over, and he got shot right in the stomach, but luckily for him it hit a button and didn't kill him. And then Hamilton realized, hey, we're surrounded. Well, they had rebuilt that fort, and the one thing they didn't do was chink the walls. So the walls are see-through. It's a night battle, and they don't put out the fires. That's not going to go over very well. And Clark's men are out in the dark, surrounding the fort with rifles that have about 200 to 300 yard range, and they're about 200 yards outside of the fort. All you're doing is firing at a really big mass in the dark. It doesn't matter what you can hit. Whereas the inside, they all have muskets and they only have 100-yard range. They can't hit anybody. In fact, one American got wounded. It's absolutely amazing that someone got hit. Because the walls aren't chinked, they can actually shoot people through the walls. And these guys are used to shooting squirrels and raccoons that go really fast and jump, and bunny rabbits. So as soon as they see someone cross that light, they fire and hit them. The big thing, though, the fort does have one thing that would have really won the battle for Hamilton. It's called cannons. But every time they try to open up a port to fire a cannon, there's about 5 rifles aimed at the same porthole. And I hate to tell you, we say we don't know of anyone that died, but someone got hit with a 58-ounce bullet from here to here. I don't think they survived. And there are 6 people I can't account for. We don't know what happened to them. They didn't go to prison, and they were wounded, but we don't know what happened to the wounded. They probably all
You mean
died.
British.
Yeah, the British. So, because you're hit from here to here. So the battle lasts all morning until morning, about 9 o'clock. And then Hamilton starts discussing surrender. And he wants to be able to take his weapons and go home. Yeah, it's not going to go over very well. And Clark wants what today we would call unconditional surrender. Back then was to surrender with discretion. In other words, I get to decide what happens to you after you surrender. Hamilton isn't having any of that. One of the big things I mentioned was the Native Americans killed. They weren't killed in the battle. They actually are coming back from the Falls of the Ohio. We don't know if they were scouting or scalping, No one ever writes about what they were doing. Obviously, Hamilton says they were scouting, and Clark says they were scalping. We don't know, but we do know when they come back to the fort, they do what most Native Americans do when they come back to a fort. They fire off all their guns. Bam, 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 yay, we're back, we won. Well, Clark's guys, there's no shooting because they're under a ceasefire. But Clark's guys said, guess what, we're going to shoot at them. And so they shoot at them after they emptied their rifles. And they kill a bunch of them, and they capture 5 of them. And Clark says, I got a great idea. I want this fort to know that if they don't surrender, I am going to massacre all of them. So what's Clark do? Right up on the road, which is the Buffalo Trace, he has them executed. And it is not pretty. They do it with tomahawks. There are 5. One is allowed to go. One of the stories go that the guy that was going to execute him is an older gentleman. He looked down and realized it was his own son wearing war paint who was off leading these evil people, as it were. So he asked Clark, can I not kill my son? And Clark is nice enough to say, yeah, I think it's okay. The other 4 are killed. I won't go into details because one is pretty brutal. The guy actually survived the first hit. So then Hamilton sees this and decides, I better discuss surrender again. They go to the church and they're discussing it, and Clark's actually washing the blood off his hands. That's what Hamilton writes in his journal. I don't think Clark killed anybody, but Clark wanted to prove a point. Hamilton was about to say, no, I don't really agree with your what you're going to give me for surrendering, so I'm going to go back to the fort. But one of the captured Virginians, who was captured by Hamilton when he showed up in December that previous year, Captain Helm, says, come on, you really ought to think about this. And they finally negotiate it out, and it really is surrender with discretion, so Clark really gets what he wants. But he does give Hamilton some honor and all of it. He gets to at least, settle his debts and stuff with the townspeople. And the French guys from Canada are allowed to go back home. And they do. But Clark makes sure he tells them to pass on a note to the commander at Fort Detroit. He said, I'm on my way up there very, very soon, and I don't care if you finish your fort and stuff up there, because that way we don't have to spend the money to do it ourselves. And so that is definitely very demoralizing to the French up in Canada, and definitely the British up there, because it sounds like Clark's on his way. And he's actually so arrogant about it that they think he's going to win as soon as he shows up. Hamilton? What happens to Hamilton? Anyone ever been to Williamsburg?
Yeah.
You ever see the goal or the jail there in Williamsburg?
Yeah.
He was actually kept in that thing for almost a year. They shackle him, send him off to prison, and he's in prison, take away his pencils and papers, and they're treating him like a prisoner. He's shackled in the jail. So Clinton, he's in New York, General Clinton, writes a nasty letter to Washington saying, how dare you keep that man in shackles and in prison? What's the hypocrisy in that? In the harbor of New York is all those prison ships with Americans on it. Clark's going to lose 2 brothers to those prison ships. They don't die on the ship, they are released, but they die within the year of being released. And they were only in their 20s.
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
So needless to say, that's kind of ironic, the whole story, that Clinton's complaining about what's happening to Hamilton when Clark's guys are going to die from it. So Hamilton's finally released. He's traded. Some people say for lieutenant colonel. And he heads up to Canada for a very short period, and then he finally gets a governorship of his own in Bermuda. Anyone ever heard of Hamilton, Bermuda? It's named after him. And then he goes to Antigua, and that's where he's going to pass away. And so that's the story for that. Clark, what happens to him? The video likes to talk about the fact he goes in debt, but they never mention where all that debt came from. It's all from Virginia. Remember I talked about Virginia wanting to give up its war debt so that the U.S. government would take it over? They forgot a lot of that debt to mention it to the U.S. government. So they actually pay some of it in 1870. And if you ever go to Terre Haute, what county is that?
Vigo.
Vigo County. Vigo wrote in his will, because they owed him $8,900, he said if the government of Virginia ever decides to pay the debt they owe me, please buy a bell for Vigo County, because Vigo County was cool enough to name a county after me. In 1870, which is about 40 years after he died, in 1836, they finally get around to paying that debt. And so the bell in Vigo County is paid for by the state of Virginia on debt owed to. And if you want to know why we have a debt, by the way, in the government, they owed Vigo $8,900. When they got around to paying them, they now owed him $42,000. And obviously they didn't pay it all off. Why didn't George's family get paid? They actually find a lot of his receipts in Richmond in 1913.
Wow, they actually found them.
They did. Someone found them by accident.
Wow.
Why did they think they lost them though? And here's a little interesting story. Remember one of those traitors in the world, Benedict Arnold? He attacked Richmond right after those receipts arrived and burned a bunch of buildings, and they thought it was in one of the buildings that burned. And the receipts, without those receipts, they won't make payment on it. Because what I do is I take a piece of paper and I split it in half, and I tell you, I owe you this much, and I write it twice. I sign both copies. I give you one copy, and I take one copy and give it to Virginia. He did. He gave all those copies to Virginia. They signed for him, so he's got the signed copy they gave him to, but then they lost him. They do, and I think it's Edward Carrington, but I'm not absolutely sure who it is, but one of the statesmen and soldiers, he's a colonel, later in Clark's life, about 1812 or so, finally gets Virginia to give him a sword and to give him $400 or 400 pounds a year as kind of a stipends to kind of feel sorry for him. This is the second sword they give him. The first sword they give him, the story goes, it was a used sword. Clark broke it over his knee and threw it in the Wabash River. The second sword was engraved and very expensive, and his niece insisted that he keeps it, but Clark, being Clark, at this point is kind of bitter. Clark said, when you needed a sword, I was there. Now I just want bread. And, I can understand why. So, he does, unfortunately, some stories say he has a stroke the next year, and for the last 5 years of his life, he's pretty much in a wheelchair and not getting to talk or really enjoy life. He is buried at Locust Grove, but in the 1870s, the one brother that is overshadowed by two younger brothers, Jonathan Clark, who, it really sucks when you get William Clark and George Rogers Clark as younger brothers, William Clark of Lewis and Clark. When he's dead, he's been dead for a while, his grandson in 1870s decides he's going to move everyone he can find to Cave Hill Cemetery. And he's going to build a monolith, not to George, he's going to build it to his dad, Jonathan. Except Louisville, being Louisville, put a big sign right next to George Rogers Clark's grave and saying, hey, this guy's really important. So even in death, poor Jonathan doesn't get all the credit. The only people not moved are William, because he's buried in Missouri. Do you blame him? He was the governor there. And the parents. Why didn't they move the parents? They can't identify the parents' bones. So they didn't want to, and back then it would have been very sacrilegious to move
Were they buried in Kentucky? Or?
No, they're buried at, they're buried at Locust Grove.
Right.
But they couldn't, when they opened up the graves for Dad and Mom,
Right.
they couldn't identify which was which. And I guess it would have been very sacrilegious to put Dad and Mom's grave and Mom and Dad's grave. So they had to actually identify the body before they could move it. So they could identify George. He's missing a leg. He loses the leg in 1809 from a fire. Some people say he was drunk. Most likely it was a stroke, but it was probably brought on by drunk. He fell in a fire and burned his leg so bad they had to amputate it. But he's also wearing a uniform, so they knew who he was. They knew who Jonathan was, and I think there's a couple others there. So it's a really nice cemetery. Unfortunately, even in death, grant you, they get these cool signs. But there's markings on the ground at Cave Hill Cemetery leading to two very important graves, and neither of them are George's. One is Colonel Sanders, and follow the yellow brick road. And the other one, follow the green brick road, goes to Muhammad Ali. So, but it is a nice, if you can find it, it's a nice spot for them to be buried, and it's well marked, and it's a nice sign and stuff like that. It's kind of neat to see people in their death, because they existed. I've done the Dead Ancestor tour a couple times, and it's kind of neat to know that I'm not just the only one in the world with my last name. So, talk about Lewis and Clark. What is the name of that expedition?
Lewis and
Core
Clark.
Discovery.
Corps of Discovery, but he called it Lewis and Clark. Do you know in actual reality, it's the Lewis expedition? Clark is only a lieutenant. And this is going to come back to bite us, our story-wise in the posteriori, because Lewis, him and Clark are so good friends that even though Congress refused to give a promotion to Clark, he goes ahead and tells everyone in the Corps of Discovery he's a captain and he's my co-leader. They do this great discovery. They come back under the same administration, Jefferson, and so it's considered a great success. However, over 40 members, the enlisted members, were court-martialed. In fact, the ship they put on the nickel never even finished the entire tour because they had to send it back with 40 people on it, were court-martialed. One guy stole a rifle and disappeared for 2 weeks. One guy tried to do a mutiny against him. Drunk on duty, sleeping on duty, all sorts of different things. But because they both cared for each other and respected each other and both gave each other the rank of captain and co-leader and didn't try to court-martial each other, and the fact they came back under the same administration, it's considered a very successful expedition.